months ago now. So we were in Nashville at the same time for Free Your Future Festival. You've talked to your audience a bit about going to a libertarian conference put on by Students for Liberty, this international students organization. And I got to say, I was really impressed by the energy around you being there, not just from fans of your channel and your work, but also just like left libertarians who are part of the movement and they come to these conferences and there's nobody ever speaking to them. There were people there who were just so excited to see you. I feel like what some of the normal Ayn Randian celebrities who might have walked in at any given time, nobody would have even noticed they were there because there were Twitch streamers on site. And it was exciting. What was your experience like? Was it generally good?
Oh, I had a great time. I had exclusively positive experiences with the people there. I didn't know what level of antagonism I'd face because, while I do have some ideological overlap with, I guess, American libertarians, there's obviously a lot of differences too. You know, most of them aren't socialists. I had a wonderful time. I do feel like the left libertarian contingent, especially in the States, is wildly underrepresented. You know, it's like, you're right. It's like mostly Ayn Rand types, which I think is a bit unfortunate. You know, personal biases aside, because it means a huge chunk of the discourse is being left on the table.
But explain to me this. I know you've talked a lot about the idea of libertarian socialism, which is puzzling for people who are traditional right libertarians like myself. Just tell us in your words, what is libertarian socialism?
Yeah, well, libertarianism, when it was originally conceptualized, was a socialist ideology. It's just about maximizing individual autonomy, which has two components, really. One of them is what many right libertarians sort of concern themselves with, which is the limitation of restrictions. How many laws is the government imposing on you? You know, how much tax, that kind of stuff, which is important to mitigate. And then there's the positive liberty that you have, the ability to act on your will. And in our world, unfortunately, you have very little ability to act on your will if you're poor. I don't think right libertarianism meaningfully addresses that. It may give you fewer obstacles on the road to being wealthy, but that's always going to be a bit of a dice roll. Not everyone can live on a yacht. Moving past that, I think, you know, it's about building up the floor so that even if you don't succeed in that respect, there's still a very high standard of living, a great guarantee that you will be able to do the things that you please, as long as you're not hurting people, of course.
So who in politics, right, if you asked me to describe right libertarianism, I could point to someone like Rand Paul to give you like a figurehead that more or less represents what I mean. Who would you point to as representative of libertarian socialism?
I think it's Noam Chomsky,
Presently,
right?
I mean, well, yeah, Noam Chomsky is absolutely a libertarian socialist, and you know, I mean, the man's ancient. Don't think he'll be running anytime soon. I'm strapped for options because there are so few socialist-aligned people. I mean, Bernie would be the closest that I'd have to say if we're talking mainstream political figures. But generally, libertarian socialism is a movement which encapsulates anarchism. So anybody who falls under that bracket is probably going to fit the bill.
Well, okay, but here's where I get confused. How can somebody who is anarchist, right, and believes in completely abolishing the state be under the same coalition as somebody like Bernie that would support having the government take over entire industries and control more than half of the economy in terms of government spending? Like, those two things seem fundamentally incompatible to me, the idea of libertarianism and government control of much of the economy.
My opinions on this get a lot of people angry at me, usually anarchists, but are you familiar with the term dictatorship of the proletariat?
Explain for the audience what you mean. I think I have an idea, but...
It's a misnomer in today's terms. When it was formed, dictatorship didn't mean anything negative. It didn't mean authoritarian. It simply meant control by. I think the argument a lot of people, myself included, make is that there are a lot of changes that would be necessary to make in any left-leaning system, anarchism, communism, which kind of necessitate a different type of political control, namely control by the working class. And that somebody like Bernie Sanders, while not an anarchist and not an abolitionist of the state, by facilitating something closer to a workers' state, by decreasing the power the bourgeois have over things, they would be nonetheless facilitating the kind of power transition necessary to make those more radical changes down the line.
Because you were talking with David Pakman the other day, and I thought you said something that was an easy digest of this, which is that you said the working class as tools of revolutionaries has basically been hundreds of years now of failed socialist experiments. And the idea here with the libertarian socialist model is, of course, that you actually have a working class led movement to change systems, to, you know, put in new regimes where elites and revolutionaries are used as tools of the working class. But it just really never seems to me that there's a way to do that.
Right. So how does one have the working class control things without doing it through the state and the government?
Well, there were worker councils, which were very popular and necessary to the Red Army prior to the Soviet Revolution. Lenin disbanded them after he won, of course. He did a lot of bad things.
Disbanded is a nice word for killed or exiled.
That's a
right.
very nice word.
Yes.
And he did quite a bit worse too. He betrayed the anarchists. He had them shot in the back of the head at the war council. Not a big fan of the guy. With regards to like better ways of handling things, I think so often, revolutions are theoretically defensible. I support the American Revolution after all, but so often the cart is put before the horse when it comes to the proper organization of things. Russia was never meaningfully capable of worker control because when the revolution took place, the population was feudal. It was barely literate. The idea that such a population could meaningfully control the organization of government without party leadership and proxies was fantastical. In the modern day, where literacy rates, at least in the West, are incredibly high, I think it's possible to facilitate a much more reasonable shift in power because we have access to the kind of, what would you call it, a civic society, where it would be more difficult for demagogues to take control of any working class movement. Ideally,
Can
obviously.
You point to somewhere in the world where something like you're describing exists that you could use as a model?
Well, I think Rojava, in spite of the horrific conditions from which it was born, in Syria, has done a pretty remarkable job applying some of the anarchist principles that I value into action with regards to, and I mean, they were working with a way worse template than us, in terms of infrastructure and social development. In terms of like modernized systems, in the context of a state, I don't think there really is one, for the main reason that a lot of these transitions are really unfavorable to the ruling class globally. And if such a change were to come about, it would have to come about in times of great destabilization, or it would have to, sort of like a big paradigm shift globally. It can't really happen piecemeal.
Well, we are absolutely like in a period of a lot of things coming apart, change, turmoil, people feeling like the ground is moving too fast underneath them. And as a result, we are seeing, I think populism is a nice word to say, but like we are seeing incredibly extremist political movements form off to the left and the right. I imagine you're excited about the energy on the left generally, but there's always going to be a mirror image to that, which would be those darned fascists. And they are real. And I guess my thing for you is like, how do you sort of calm the waters here and instill sort of a new sort of civic democracy in the United States absent revolutionary change? Like it's such a big, lofty, almost impossible goal. Can't you just do things within the system that make things work? Because what you're always talking about is like factions will eventually strike bad bargains with one another. That's what you're describing in Lenin's Russia. You try to work together, you think you have shared goals, but then eventually one will always knife the other in the back. I think that there are simple things that you can do to try to restore the equilibrium in our own country. I'm a proponent of universal basic income as a way to move towards more of a socialized economy, but do it through the fruits of capitalism and free markets. How do you feel about that?
Well, I agree with you. There are positive changes that could be made, but I think you're swimming uphill past a point. All the things you and I value politically are probably theoretically achievable under a constitutional monarchy, maybe even an absolute dictatorship. It's not impossible to have UBI, like councils, this, that, and the other, economic and civil liberties. You can have all those things. It's just they're not conducive to the political situation that those types of governments tend to create. And likewise, I think bourgeois government tends to facilitate naturally political and social situations which require tremendous economic inequality. Is it theoretically possible to achieve all of these things under the system that we live today? Possibly, I guess, but I would bet as much for that as I would, a pharaoh instituting, a fair tax, unions, and civil liberties.
But
It seems to me antithetical.
how can you have a big government that doesn't become what you're describing? Because it seems to me anytime you have centralized power, right, absolute power corrupts absolutely, it will then be wielded at the behest of lobbyists and wealthy constituents and donors and people with the means. To me, the answer then is decentralization, free markets, extremely limited government. But if you're talking about different forms of collective control or collectivism, how are they not going to fall victim to the exact same forces? There's always going to be an elite and a powerful. Why wouldn't your form of collectivism still fall victim to those influences?
Well, I don't disagree at all. But decentralization does not necessarily mean free market, after all. I'm a big advocate for worker cooperatives or any kind of decentralized, non-government owned manner by which the workers can directly control the places they work. That would, at least in my opinion, be a boon both to civil liberties and to sort of decentralized advocacy. And there are ways to have government control without it being centralized, after all. It's possible to have government-funded, decommodified institutions that are not directly beholden to political interests. For example,
like
the post
add like
office.
a layer of specificity here, because with like worker co-ops, this comes up a lot, and I still can never picture like what these things actually look like. In my time in college, I played in a bunch of punk bands, and almost every show would be at like a cooperative grocery store's back room or a cooperative bookstore's back room. And all of those cooperatives were eventually shuttered within like a year. It was always like trying to find where the next co-op would pop up so that you could host your shows there at night. And I think for me, that was my only experience ever, was that you always saw these places with their almost bare shelves. They close after a year because nobody wants to run these places effectively. And so my impression of co-ops have just always been these places that have for rent signs on the front window. How does it work?
I can't speak to that specifically, but the data on worker cooperatives is pretty promising. Well, I mean, essentially what you have is the simplest form is you have a traditional managerial structure, except the people underneath the manager get to vote in the person who's currently in charge, which I think solves a lot of problems. Nobody really likes their boss, after all. The idea is that there would be a baseline level of civic participation in the workplace. We're not talking a meeting every day, just, 5 minutes you get caught up on how things are going, and that you would vote on who that manager is. And if the manager is poorly representing you, you could replace them. The data we have in worker cooperatives, I think, is pretty promising in terms of resistance to price shocks, likelihood of staying open, and worker happiness, which massively increases when people have a sense of control over things, and real control. I mean, there are a lot of workplace rules that are arbitrary and cruel in the United States, like grocery store workers can't sit, for example, often at the checkout, which is horrible for older people or people with disabilities. These rules are, I think some middle manager just said it would increase productivity by 0.1%. They've just rolled with it globally since. But stuff like that, little changes like that, I think massively increase the happiness of people.
Why can't a co-op like that exist in a free market as we have it now in many industries? We have a lot of not free markets, but I'm saying, like, why does that require something different than a free market system?
Oh, no, they can. They absolutely can. And when we're talking about, the implementation of these co-ops, a lot of the work that needs to be done, if you value them, which I do, is just social, prioritizing them, normalizing them. There are also some tax codes concerning co-ops that are a little bit funky in the United States. It's not as easy or convenient as with traditional, LLCs or other businesses. But if you iron that stuff out, I think the groundwork is essentially laid. But there's a critical difference between having the ability to have worker cooperatives and having enough of them that you meaningfully challenge traditional bourgeois economic control. And that's a pretty huge tipping point. And I think that tipping point is where the difficulty comes in, because there's no reason why they would ever want that to happen. They could organize protests, campaigns, political action against cooperatives. There's any number of propaganda points you could.
But if they're great, right? If they're the great place to work, if they succeed, they stay open and they thrive. I mean, That's what free markets are all about. When they're not monopolized and there's no government on the scale, they'd win out in a competition. More workers would want to go there. More people would want to patronize. They would multiply and populate. So I'm not sure I see what the issue is, unless, of course, you have other interests that come in and use the government to shut them down.
I feel like we see like the ethic of the worker cooperative idea sort of seeping into elite institutions, like particularly like in journalism, where you sort of see these constant revolts at tech companies and at the New York Times or Washington Post by like entry-level staffers and people who have just been hired who want everything to be democratized and to break down like the managing editor roles and have the executive editors of papers answer to the people who do social media copy and all this stuff. And it just causes total chaos because you can't actually get business done and create value for your customers when your primary concern is always the feelings of every single employee.
I think there's some variance to that. You could argue worker cooperatives are less advantageous to the employee, but that's sort of a every man's the case until you're that employee situation. It's kind of the same with worker rights. Maybe service would be better at a place where they're not allowed lunch breaks and they get fired at any one infraction. But I would rather work at places where even if it means I have to wait a smidge longer, I know the workers are being treated well. Because I mean, eventually, if that rule is applied to everyone gets treated better. I think the history of, workplace accommodations in the United States is a history of racing to the bottom. While it is true that cooperatives tend to do quite well, there is going to be a home field advantage to the trillions of dollars already existing in corporations that are capable of fielding investment through private entrepreneurship and through, leveraging their worth on the stock market. These are institutions that have every possible pre-existing advantage, some of them quite a bit more powerful on their own politically and economically than your average, Eastern European state. So given that advantage, it's entirely possible that there are externalities we're not accounting for, which might not even take the field when traditional businesses, take to hold. For example, nothing in the free market mandates good treatment of your workers. We see that all over the world. It's political pressure which does that, which we use the state to mandate. But outside of that, the workers that are treated the worst usually extol the most profits for their owner. And that's obviously not a race to the bottom we want to participate in.
I don't think that's true. I'm
going to put a pin in it here real quick and we can get right back to it. Want to pause and say hello 20 minutes late to everyone watching or listening. We normally do this in the first 5 minutes. Say hi, thanks for watching the show. We'll do it now. I'm Steven. This is Right Now on the Rightly channel, and I've got here my friend Brad Palumbo, free market evangelical and contributor to Right Now. And joining us from somewhere in real America, we've got Vaush. A quick reminder, if you haven't done so already, give us a like and subscribe. We have new episodes every Thursday and bonus content throughout the week. So leave us a comment, let us know what you think. I almost always respond and write back, and we'll be pals whether or not you say nice things or not, and it'll all be great. So back to what we were talking about here. Brad, did you want to dig in on that you kind of don't buy?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to get hung up on it, but I'm just saying, look at the economic freedom indexes of the world, right? And look at the freer economies that are less regulated, less taxed, and look at the list of countries at the top of that list. Look at the quality of a worker's life and average income and working conditions in those countries, and then go down that list and look. So I don't buy the notion that free market capitalism is bad for workers. I mean, free market capitalism and global trade is responsible for massive reductions in absolute poverty across the last 30 years, massive decreases in child mortality, competitive markets give workers options. The problem is when we have monopoly.
I don't think, and this is me trying to interpret like as most charitably what Vaush has been saying here, is I don't think that he's critiquing this as like the ultimate evil of all time. I think that what you're describing, free markets and capitalism, all that great stuff, give us the most opportunity and space for everybody to try and carve out the kind of lives and communities that they would like to have. However, I think the thing that drives me away from the capitalist mindset as well is that meaning, purpose, happiness, that you're actually living a good and fulfilling life is just purely going to come from being employed and the GDP of a country and all that kind of stuff. Like there's got to be something
But is that really?
else
I don't
out
think
there.
that's ever really been the libertarian or capitalist ethos, at least not
I think we get
at
sucked into
principle.
it a little bit too giddily.
But rightly understood,
I'll
the idea.
say,
Oh, sure, go ahead.
oh no, I just want to say, the 18th century, more or less, I'm simplifying, gave way to the concept of nation states. What was before empires, disparate tribal communities. The idea of borders, of leaders, of nations came about. And initially, these nations were overwhelmingly not democratic. But the period following the nationalization of the world was one which did reduce significantly danger in quite a few places. It did consolidate kingdoms. It did cull out borders. It did, dissuade tribal rivalries. It was a period of improvement in many respects, in some ways negative, but I think, if nothing else, it was a stabilizing force. And I think in many ways we're seeing something similar from capitalism. Capitalism, it's true, under capitalism, extraordinary global progress has been made. It would be ridiculous to deny that. But we have to see, has the system done everything it could, or are there ways to improve it? In the case of the nation states, the critical improvement was democracy. And I think with our economy, the answer must necessarily be the same. You have the base economic benefits of a modern, democratic, technologically advanced economy. But what can you do if you make it meaningfully accountable to the people, not to some, elite group of tech oligarchs, people with old money, people who lucked into it? And some people, don't get me wrong, who worked really hard. Bezos worked really hard. But I didn't elect them. And they still have more power than quite a few political leaders in this country. That's sort of the economic form of a warlord, somebody who's capable of, without any kind of democratic mandate, seizing enormous personal power. And while that might be better to living in the wastes, I think we can improve on that. I think it's
The
possible.
other day in your conversation with Pacman, you were talking about the socialist movement in the United States, kind of what the DSA is for and all that kind of stuff. And you mentioned that you thought the primary function of the socialist movement in the United States was to stop, confront, minimize fascism. Could you unpack that?
Yeah, I think there's a very liberal mindset. It couldn't happen here, which really bothers me. It's ahistorical. The Weimar Republic before Nazi Germany took over was a relatively progressive and well-to-do place, Great Depression aside. And fascism, as we understand it, is very ideologically idiosyncratic. We don't think of it as something fundamentally American, but the Nazis had many American supporters before the war, and they took their ideas in eugenics from our researchers and scientists. I think the roots of American fascism have been here for a while. You've seen it rear its ugly head before World War II, afterwards with McCarthyism.
Will you define
And
fascism?
right now, sure. The simplest definition, I think, is what is it? Palingenetic ultranationalism. The idea of like the nation will be reborn.
Okay.
There's this a phoenix. But I think there are a lot of really complicated social forces behind it. Like what tendencies? Misogyny tends to be a big part of it. Ethno-nationalism. It's dangerous, and I think it's rearing its head as populism becomes
Do
more
you
powerful.
think that the left, and yourself included, play a role in being hyper-focused on these grand narratives of history, this sort of historical struggle between fascism, communism, these two left-right poles? I think these different warriors who end up falling into one of either camp, because they're both the most appealing. They give you this grand sense of purpose, this grand sense of struggle, and being part of these movements that are going to change the world. Either take us back to the past, the eagle born from the ashes, the phoenix born from the ashes, or a utopian future. I think that the left does way too much work for the far right to try to push people into that corner by throwing the word fascist around callously, to call people white supremacists, to call this person and that person a Nazi because they step slightly out of line on identity issues or politically correct kind of talk, right? Like Tumblr liberalism. I really worry about your role and the role of the far left in perpetuating this divide and the rearing of the head of fascism.
It's possible, though I do wonder what it says about people who move towards fascism because they feel the left was overeager
Because they're
in their
nasty to them.
denunciations.
They're because the left
Oh,
is
sure,
like
but
they go to the people
to
with the open
fascism?
arms. You know this. I mean, come on. People with the open arms versus the people who are just trying to like make your life miserable online and slander you. Like you're gonna go closer, even if you don't even mean to, towards
But
the
also, how do we
people
know who the real
treat you with
fascists are
respect.
if you call everyone a fascist? They might not know they're going into the arms of a fascist commentator or authoritarian because the left has called everybody that. I mean, then they no longer, it's like the boy who cried wolf syndrome, right? When we actually have racists, and we do have some crazy racist people on the far right that are gaining prominence. And some of them are authoritarian or theocratic.
They
or
really
oliphist.
they really hate this show.
But yeah, absolutely. But my whole point is that when you throw that label around like it's candy on Halloween, you weaken it.
Well, I'll say I think that, being moved towards fascism because of the behavior of the left denotes a kind of susceptibility, if nothing else, which is worthy of concern outside the broader behavior of the left. There is a historical tendency, I think, for the left to overfixate on the grand narrative and to overuse these terms. But, with the caution of sounding like one of these people, I do feel like, if anything, the term fascism is underused. I think that what we have right now in this country is a situation where the Republican Party is essentially just the fascist party, not in evoked policy because we have a democratic country, but rather in their aims, their efforts, their goals.
I think you
that
could say
were it
that of
not
the
for
MAGA
norms,
movement. I think you
yeah.
could say
So
that of the MAGA movement. Yeah.
It's our institutions, right? I mean, in a weaker country, Donald Trump with the election business, or January 6th, that could have been it. A country without very strong democratic institutions, that might have been it right there. He could have, foisted power within the military. There could have been a coup, 6 months of media blackout, and then we could have been, living in Magaland forever. Now, it didn't happen here, and that's a good thing. We should recognize that America's institutions and their strength is what shields us for a time, but only for a time.
I do want to go back, though,
in the same way.
I want to push.
Oh, sure.
I want to push on the idea that, if there's something like you push towards fascism because leftists are mean to you, that there's like something wrong with you. I think that it's just sort of a fact that everyone has like latent totalitarianism just beneath the surface with themselves. Buried underneath all of us is a desire to control things, the desire to not live in a chaotic world. Maybe you're an exception to that, and there are like rare exceptions to this instinct. But most people want things to be ordered, and they're going to move towards the people who offer order in some way, shape, or form. I believe that arc about history, and I think it's just, I don't know. I think it's just sort of pie in the sky thinking to be like, yes, we can be awful, mean to people online. We can move the goalposts every year on the words and the pronouns that people use to talk to each other, and then be surprised when they start playing footsie with people who they shouldn't be playing footsie with on the far right, who are saying, we're going to stop these crazy
And it's not even just that. It's also cancel people, get them fired from their jobs, harass people, show up at their houses, dox J.K. Rowling. Like, it's not just changing norms about pronouns and everything. It's about the vicious backlash a lot of people face. And I think it's perfectly natural to go into the opposite arms of people.
I want to caution some of this because I genuinely believe the behaviors you're describing right now are almost universal. Whether we're talking about doxing or harassment, canceling people, harassing people online, these are absolutely not trademarked to the left. I think these are ubiquitous behaviors. I think the issue is that fascism is easier to fall in because it requires zero ideological discipline. All you really need is a fundamental belief there's something wrong with society as a product of weakness and degeneracy. You need to have a strong attachment to something iconographic, whether it's the white race, America, something to rally that attitude towards. And then the political prescriptions follow from that. I think being on the left requires a bit more thought. And that's, that's a bit of an uphill struggle because I swear to God, you go online and it's like, hey, join the left or the right, random 14-year-old white boy. If you join the left, okay, here's your dictionary on like all the problematic stuff you like, and here's all the info on how to interact with people who are of different races or ethnicities. And then if you go over on the right, it's like they ask nothing of you. We can say the N-word here, or maybe not. You know, it depends.
No, I don't think you can in almost any spaces
I'm
on
sorry.
the right.
When I'm thinking on the right, I'm thinking 4chan. My bad. I should be more specific. When we're talking like in the more like fascist spaces on the internet, at least, they ask very little of you. Just come over here, be funny, be edgy, and the political prescriptions flow naturally from the contempt that we express through humor at these groups, and that's a tough battle to win because they have, you know, there's a very low bar to entry.
So I think what you're saying is correct.
Sorry.
I think what you're saying is correct. You know, the idea that fascism is more of this sort of ethic, this sort of way of being, where communism is very specific about the things that you're going to adhere to. Like you can just go on the internet right now, like search for like communist, fascist, like Venn diagram. And I think it is absolutely true that fascism just takes multiple different forms, and communism requires very specific ideological prescriptions about policy. And fascism is more about, you know, reclaiming the past. It's about usually gender roles or masculinity, stuff like that. It just presents itself in a certain way. However, something that is way more specific than fascism is sort of this attitude, white supremacy. You have called our friend Gothics a white supremacist, and, you know, I guess that by extension means a Nazi. How on earth does that make sense? How is that constructive to call Black creators who just don't agree with you on identity politics stuff white supremacists? Because my brother was an anarcho-punk for several years. He would call me a fascist all the time because I voted for Mitt Romney, and whatever, fine, I'll take it. But you can't just call people Nazis. Like, that just does not seem to be a good way to do discourse, and it really waters down the problem, because I think it's a problem, and I worry about it a lot, that it's going to rear its head in a big, big way in the future again. But how are you not, like, making this problem worse by doing that?
Well, first of all, I don't think white supremacist and Nazi are equivalent at all. There's a lot more that goes into being a Nazi. But if you're just to take the white supremacist angle, first, I'll absolutely call people of color white supremacists. You know, I'm very equal opportunity in that respect. I think the idea that your behavior or your attitudes engender a sort of social, making advantage for white people. I don't think that's a racial lines thing. Honestly, I've talked to quite a few people of color who I would describe as white supremacists, and God bless them. With Gothic specifically, I think it was
because they think they can,
with, like,
they
all
can
lives.
do things themselves without the help of
Or
white saviors. Like,
No,
Don't you don't find it ironic to
they-
be labeling as a white dude a Black person a white supremacist because they disagree with you on racial issues?
Wait, do you guys think that you couldn't call a person of color white supremacist? Like, can't people of color also believe the same things?
I think
that white
in the
supremacists
most
would do?
absolute extreme, like a Black Klans member, you could call a white supremacist. But I think the bar has to be, I mean, I get this. People tell me I'm a self-hating, homophobic gay, right? But the bar for you to say to a Black person that they actually think they're inferior and that their family is inferior to white people and that they have sold their soul to the devil, basically, to peddle talking points, that takes some gall to accuse of another person. And I feel like the bar for saying that should be extremely high, and it seems like it's just become, well, you disagree with the left on some cultural or race issues, and that's all it takes.
It depends on how you disagree on the race issues, for sure. For me, the bar is exactly the same. I think that if, you know, your political prescriptions or your, you know, beliefs socially align with white supremacy, that regardless of what creed or race or color you are, I think it's a fair prescription to make. Now, you two and I, would probably disagree on where the bar should be with regards to white supremacy. I think it broadly encapsulates a lot of social tendencies as well. It wouldn't necessarily require specifically believing the inferiority of non-white people. But I think in regards to the Gothics, I think
That's
it was
kind of
some All Lives
definitional.
Matter related.
yeah,
discourse.
only
like
academically minded people and very online people believe that. Everybody.
Well, can I say why?
Sure.
The reason why is because we've artificially placed these bars in a place where we're only looking at the absolute most explicit behavior, you know. So what we've done, and, you know, what was it? Lee Atwater talked about this, the Southern strategy. It used to be racists would say N-word, 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 you know. Come the 1960s, you can't do that anymore. So instead they talk about forced busting and segregation. Well, it's about the codification of white supremacy into more normalized language. So nowadays, you know, when the MAGA types are talking about Black Lives Matter invading the suburbs, they can't say race war But that's the tone is meant to evoke essentially the same political response.
It couldn't have
With the
anything
white
to do with
supremacy
riots
stuff,
that literally people died and stores were destroyed and looted and vandalized in the name of Black Lives Matter. It couldn't have anything to do with that.
well, all civil rights protests lead to some degree of social unrest, sir. I think BLM was generally quite peaceful. But the issue there is the suburbs. That's the weird thing to me, because BLM didn't do anything to the suburbs.
You're not, no, you're
Most
right.
protests are held. Well, most protests are held in cities. They're usually, when there's damage, it's done in inner city areas. That's, I mean, there's just more people there, wider boulevards. The suburbs, along with other language used, encodes a kind of racial terminology, which I think is meant to sort of passively imply, at least the kind of social, what did you say? I think it suggests something. Now, obviously, I'm discussing very abstract language here, but there is a push in this country for white supremacists to not mean anything outside of like Klan members, people saying the N-word, and like skinheads in prison. And I think that's a little bit unfortunate, because the real damage done through white supremacy is not Klan members or skinheads in prison. It's, people in suits who go to DC, who dress their language up properly, who never talk about race directly, but only talk about it through abstracted euphemisms that they then use to do systemically infinitely more damage than you could ever do by being some random Klansman or a lyncher somewhere in Alabama.
So why couldn't they just be
It's
wrong?
important to keep an eye out for that.
Why can't you disagree with somebody and just say they're wrong and here's why, instead of throwing labels on them that are ultimately meant to discredit? I mean, when you call somebody a white supremacist, you're saying this person is evil. You're saying their views are illegitimate, right? You're saying they're motivated by animus and hatred. And most public policy issues, and I bet you would agree on this in a different context, are complicated, and people of good faith can land on either side. So the same way that, like, I don't like when people on the right shut down a Democrat and say they just hate America, or, they're just a communist, right? It's a way of delegitimizing the other side when you really, I think, should be willing to just say that they're wrong and here's why.
The issue is that historically in America, hating America has never really been like a big policy thrust. It's never been a big motivating force. Neither is communism. Racism, however, has centuries of very explicit policy and social force moving it. Communists don't tend to dog whistle, If you disagreed with me, you could fairly call me a commie, socialist, anarchist. It's a label that you could fairly apply. But there is ambiguity to those labels too. When it comes to something like white supremacy, I'm only trying to put name to a set of policies and beliefs that I think are destructive. Now, you say it's discrediting. I agree with that. And if people disagree with me, I also tend to think it's discrediting. I agree with my opinions, of course. I mean, I think we all do. But I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with impugning that or codifying that.
You wouldn't mind if I just called you a white
the bar is
supremacist if
higher.
you disagree with me about things? Just casually throw out, or you're homophobic, actually, because we disagree about taxes.
If you can make an argument that if you could make an argument that a disagreement between you and I was that my position was harmful to non-white people or to gay people in some meaningful way, then I would accept. I might disagree with that prescription, but I would accept the logic of you calling me that.
That's just wrong. I mean, you can't win over people's hearts and minds when you put them into this box of trying to predict and prescribe what their intentions are by supporting a certain policy. I mean, this is the whole.
Not intentions.
Right.
Not intentions.
Intentions versus what you want to see happen in society versus what does happen. Like the idea that white supremacy is structural, like it just allows you to do whatever you want in the discourse.
Just label your opponents as illegitimate.
I think you can make fair arguments for these things, right? I just want to say, because we have fundamental disagreements, and that's perfectly fine. But I do protest the idea that these accusations are spurious. We can disagree, as you've said, but I don't think it's about randomly labeling people, though some people on the left certainly do. I mean, people on the right are calling everyone a commie or hating America, and I agree. I think that's also destructive. But if you can make a good argument, I think there's descriptive utility to these terms outside of intent. That, maybe your behavior is in line with something. But to me, it's non-essentialist. I just want to make that clear. If there are people in my community who were Nazis 2 years ago, actual honest to God.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people, they've got their tattoo removal. I don't assign moral worth to who you were, only who you are. If a person's beliefs are bad, or I would codify them as white supremacy, to me, that's an ascription to a historical trend, not a condemnation of intent. It can be unintentional. Lord knows knows, I've had problematic beliefs since starting streaming that I would call in line with white supremacy. That might be a really low bar, and I totally understand that. I wouldn't use that language if I was a politician, but it's not just a petty mudslinging effort. I do try to be consistent with the application of these labels, even if you think they're, done too frivolously.
That might be how you personally think of it, but that's not the meaning that label has when you throw it around in our society. It's not at all.
I'm always free to talk about it.
Wow.
I've tried to talk with Gothics, by the way. She doesn't. I tried to meet her for your future fest. If she doesn't want to talk to me, that's fine. You don't have to. But I'm always down to talk about that. It could be that accusation was totally unwarranted, but
Well,
I won't know until I talk with her, I guess.
I appreciate you being willing to talk about it. My concern, just to kind of round us down here, is that it does not seem like a coincidence to me that the same period we have seen of, I think, the far right swelling in size and intensity, particularly online, and then bursting out of the real world, is also happening at the same time. There's just been this incredible liberalization and panic over the idea that these people exist. It pushes people who are otherwise fence sitters, who I think do not want to be involved in these movements, to feel like they have no other fighter in these grand narratives between the left and the right. And then they end up slipping right into whoever's going to be open arms to them and treat them with some dignity and respect. I think that this strategy is backfiring, and I don't think the left is going to admit it until it's too late. And I just really want to see it stop. But on that note, let's head out, because Vaush, I had an impression of you coming into this conversation and kind of like going through your channel past couple of months since we met in Nashville, that you kind of like I view most far left creators as being a little bit nihilistic about the future, a little bit cynical about politics. And I actually find that that's not always the case with you on your channel. And you did a video about a week ago pinpointing 10 things that you're happy about and excited about the future.
Right.
A little bit of hopium, which is apparently controversial to Pepe the Frog. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to share something that you are hopeful about with the future, and something that actually has you optimistic. I'll start, if we may. I saw a piece in Al Jazeera actually this morning showing that they are now making a breakthrough to offer blood tests for people with different forms of mood disorders. So they're going to be able to, with RNA markers in people's blood, be able to distinguish whether or not a person really has bipolar, or if they're dealing with a more temporary form of depression, or if they have something else in that category of mood disorders. Because right now,
with the Bill Gates chip.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right.
I'm kidding.
Right now, I really hate the way it's done. It's all head shrinking. It's all just doctors giving you a one-size-fits-all pill when they check the box that you've been feeling sad. And I really don't. I don't trust it, and I think it's been bad for society. So if they can actually make a big breakthrough on this to test different kinds of mood disorders, I'd be very optimistic about the future.
Yeah, I'll go next. First of all, I think that's lovely. I actually suffer from bipolar depression myself, and it was only through the big brain psychiatric evaluation that I was able to correctly diagnose that. Being able to do so, through blood testing sounds incredible. I think there's a lot of really encouraging medical stuff on the way. I did talk about this in the video, but like, for example, Alzheimer's research, the potential for developing some kind of meaningful treatment towards it, or even a vaccine. But I think I'll say something, then I'll clarify why. I think it's probably the rate of acceptance of trans people in the United States. How rapidly it's grown in the past 10 years. It's gone from like the 15 to like 60% or something like that. And, it's trans people are a minority in the population. It's not necessarily about that, but I think there's a broader willingness in the modern world to accept what we would consider divergent behavior, just anything outside of the norm, which I think broadly encompasses a lot of stuff. I think that's really, really, really helpful. Not just for trans people, but because you never know what the next issue is going to be. There are lots of adjacent issues as well that I feel could be improved through proxy. Like, for example, like child trafficking is adjacent to a lot of stuff concerning like the social attitudes towards parental abuse or sex work. There's like, it's like a huge umbrella of issues. But I think as a society, we're getting quicker at finding the beat on problems like this. And I think that's really good.
Brad?
Well, a statistic I read that actually surprised me is I think we all agree climate change is a very real issue that we need to do something about. But actually, when you zoom out a little, things are not as bad as you might think. Doom scrolling through TikTok or listening to Greta. The number of climate-related deaths and like extreme heat, droughts, natural disasters has actually decreased almost 99% since 1920. So I guess that heartened me a little bit just to take a little bit of the panic off of the discourse on that issue. Not that it's not still important, but just that we're not all going to die in 7 years.
I like the sound of that. All right, that's it for this episode of Right Now. I'm Stephen Kent. Thank you again to Vaush for joining us. And if you're watching this right now, subscribe to the channel. What the heck are you waiting for? We had Vaush on today. We had Dylan Burns a few weeks ago, Ariel Scarcella, Gothics, Rand Paul, Nick Gillespie, and even the guy who played Jacob from Lost. So you're missing out if you're not subbed. We're also on TikTok because I hear Gen Z consumer preferences matter or something like that. Oh, and by the way, thank you to everyone who picked up my new book, my first book, How the Force Can Fix the World. It hit #1 on Amazon's marketplace for political history ebooks and is nearly in the top 20 for hardcover political books. And I am freaking astounded, grateful, and excited about how many people are out there enjoying my little love letter to the politics of Star Wars. So if you have a copy, it makes a great gift for Christmas. Or if you don't, you need to go get one. And that is going to be it for today. As always, keep asking why. Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate it. It's been an exciting month, man. But yeah, as always, keep asking why, stay out of line, and be a bug in the system. Have a great week, folks.